Hello, I'm Marcia Kavanaugh. Thanks for joining us. Well, after years of debate, bids have been presented about how to redevelop Big Charity. We'll take a look. School was out this week for trumpeter Irvin Mayfield, who resigned a lucrative teaching position at UNO. If Mayor Landrieu has his way, the bugler may soon be playing taps for some public monuments, though some political reaction is building. We'll discuss these stories tonight, plus take a special look at the surge in home prices, and the wolf is at Loyola University's door. On stage for us are tonight's Informed Sources. Errol, Laborde, producer of Informed Sources. David Hammer, reporter, WWL-TV Channel 4. Katherine Sayer, reporter, NOLA.com, the Times-Picayune. And Jeff Adelson, reporter, the New Orleans Advocate. And we're going to go first over to Katherine. And Big Charity has been sitting there unused now for 10 years. Really just been a sore point to a lot of people. But there are now some proposals that have been submitted to the state for use of it.
Absolutely, yeah. So the state now owns the building. You know, it's been replaced by University Medical Center, which just opened across Claiborne Avenue, and the state is trying to figure out what to do with it. And so they put out a call to developers to see what interest was out there, and they got 5 proposals. One was from an academic group out of North Carolina. They were kind of pitching to be a consultant for the state and guide them through the search. So not exactly what the state was looking for, I think. And then you had Healing Minds NOLA, which is a group really focused on mental health care in the city. And they want to convert Charity into a mental health care facility with some affordable housing component to it. But with that plan, there's not a clear financing structure or revenue source. And then you have 3 really real estate private sector driven proposals. And you know, the 3, they propose largely the same concepts. Because, you know, Charity is a huge building.
It is huge. And it's not just the main tower, there are 2 other buildings next to it, right, that are part of it.
Exactly. So there's the Delgado building and the Butterworth building is what they're known as. So it's going to have to be a mixed-use proposal of some kind that eventually gets picked. So there's a residential component to them all, so with apartments at different levels of rent, depending on your income. There's some component of medical research, lab space, or medical office space, street-level retail that's really neighborhood-oriented, and then an extended stay hotel targeted at, you know, like visiting researchers, visiting doctors who may need somewhere to stay.
And also families of patients.
Exactly. So that's a great point, because all of these proposals are banking on University Medical Center and the VA hospital, that whole complex, spurring a larger biomedical corridor that, you know, economic development leaders have been talking about for a long time in this city, really hasn't come to fruition. So this would be a big bet on that hospital complex spurring something big.
And some of the housing too would be directly related to people in the medical profession. The idea is to give them a place to live where they could just walk to work.
Exactly. Yeah. So several of the proposals talk about workforce housing, so at a more moderate income for medical students who are in their residencies, nurses, so people who will be staffing those hospitals.
Katherine, what's the status of those buildings? Are they totally ready to go if there were tenants ready to go?
The buildings, like Charity?
Yes.
I mean, it's going to require a multi-million-dollar renovation.
Because there was that big fight between the state and the feds over what the true damage from Hurricane Katrina was, and it seemed highly political, and there was a lot of allegations that it was being trumped up, and then attempts to turn it into City Hall and things like that because of the Art Deco historic nature. But it's, I mean, it still needs more work.
Yeah, let's talk about price tag. I mean, David's onto a good thing here. Let's talk about price tag. What are these proposals saying it's going to take to renovate the place?
So they're roughly in the $200 million neighborhood. From what I've looked at in the proposals, a lot of those costs are simply taking it from the hospital use and putting it into so many different kinds of uses. I think that's where, you know, the big price tag comes in. And the developers are proposing different ways of going about that with the state. So CHR Partners is a group that was formed specifically to pursue charity, and it's an investor out of New York and a local developer named Joseph Stebbins, and they're teaming up with some other locals. They want to buy Charity for $30 million.
And that's different from the other two who want to lease it from the state.
Yes.
Okay.
HRI Properties, New Orleans entity, and Matthews Southwest, a developer out of Dallas, they're pitching a plan where they enter into a cooperative endeavor agreement with the state. So basically a long-term lease, similar to how the city is redeveloping the World Trade Center.
Okay, so we have these ideas now before the state, and it is the state who's going to make the decision. It is state property. What kind of timeline are we looking at? When is the decision going to be made? And there's just a lot of work ahead, it would seem.
Absolutely. So the only thing that I know about a timeline is that the state set a tentative date for either a sale or signing that agreement on September 11th. But so far, I've heard nothing about a decision. As of Tuesday, when I checked in, there was no news.
But if, in fact, during this calendar year, what to do with the World Trade Center and what to do with Charity Hospital are both resolved, that'd be quite an accomplishment.
It definitely would be progress, yeah.
And whatever it is, you knew from the very beginning, if it wasn't going to be a hospital, it had to be some kind of mixed-use thing, because I think it's so big, you need to...
It is.
You need to mix your uses.
Yeah, well, it could handle it, certainly.
Yeah, sure.
And it, you know, it would be, you know, it sort of stands to reason that they're proposing that it would be closely related to the hospitals in the medical field.
Yeah.
That's what its use would be.
And if all this happens, this could be the one big step for Tulane Avenue, which is certainly improving in many, many ways, and this could really just be a major step.
Okay, Katherine, thanks a lot. Okay, now on to something that's a big discussion in the city, and you were there yesterday, Jeff, at 2 commission hearings, and this is regarding the removal of monuments, what's called the Confederate monuments, 4 of them, in the city. So what were those 2 meetings like?
Well, the 2 meetings were meetings from the Historic District Landmark Commission and the Human Relations Commission. Both of those are city commissions. They were considering the fate of the 4 monuments, as you said, the Robert E. Lee Monument at Lee Circle, the PGT Beauregard statue at City Park, the White League Monument on
Liberty
Iberville.
Monument, yeah.
Yeah. And
Jeff Davis.
The Jeff Davis,
Yeah.
thank you. On Jefferson Davis Parkway.
Yeah.
And so both commissions essentially cleared the way for the city council to remove the monuments from public places. There's a ordinance on the books in the city that allows the council to decide that a monument is a nuisance because it either promotes ideologies that are that go against the Equal Rights Amendment and other federal law, because it could incite violence, or because keeping it up and keeping it protected would be too much of a strain on the city.
Now, this is something that the mayor wants to see happen. He says he wants to see him come down. I want to get from you. You were there in those 2 meetings yesterday. What was the feeling? What was the atmosphere?
It's interesting. It was very tense at both meetings. You've got a lot of really passionate partisans on both sides of this issue. The HDLC meeting, a lot of passionate arguments, a lot of people calling for the monuments to be taken down because of both what they represent at the time, which a lot of people argue was sort of a revisionist history of the Confederacy and sort of continued expression of white supremacy in the post-Civil War era. And because of the message that they continue to send to black residents of the city about those issues and about sort of where they stand in the city's view. A lot of residents for the monuments were saying that they should be kept because of their historic nature in the city, because these were part of their heritage. Several people, including a gentleman who identified himself as a descendant of Beauregard, said they should stay because it's an affront to the people, to their ancestors who had fought in the Civil War.
So is anybody actually standing on the side of keeping the Liberty Monument?
That's actually interesting. The Liberty Monument is a monument to white citizens who rioted against the Reconstruction era government. No one has specifically spoken out in favor of that, and even a couple people who were in favor of keeping the Lee Monument, the Beauregard Monument, said, you know what, we can get rid of that, of the Liberty Monument. That's not a That's not something we're going to stand for.
But before we run out of time on the segment, I do want you to touch on the fact that our governor has sort of entered into the fray, saying that he's going to research, seeing if he could prevent those monuments from being taken down.
Yes, the governor has said he's looking at ways to prevent the monuments from coming down. Last night, in response to the HDLC's decision, he actually cited a specific act which does not apply in Louisiana, but the administration is still looking into different ways they may be able to intervene. We've been told by the Lieutenant Governor's office, which is responsible for historic preservation, that there's not a lot that they can actually do to step in from the state level. Most of what they do is advisory rather than enforcement.
And so these two commissions have made recommendations to City Council. Who is going to make the decision?
The City Council will be making the decision. We don't know when yet. The meeting hasn't been scheduled, and it's unclear exactly how much more public input they're going to take before making a decision.
That's what I was going to ask. Any more public hearings? Do we know of any that are scheduled?
There will be at least one more at the council when they vote on the ordinance. Additional ones are also possible.
All right, Errol, I know you wanted to touch on this and the politics involved in this whole issue.
Well, I've been curious with the public reaction out there, what the polls were saying, if indeed there were polls. An indication that there were polls was when David Vitter came out during the week and said, you know, the mayor is failing in fighting crime. He should be fighting crime instead of worrying about the monuments. And that told me he's seen a poll. And according to our friend Jeremy Alford in his La Politics newsletter, he said that there was something done in a Vern Kennedy poll, which essentially showed, now this is statewide, but this issue is going statewide, even though it's a New Orleans issue. People are hearing about it. And that, as you expect, among white voters, there's a negative. If there was a candidate who was in favor of Landrieu's proposal, it would resonate negatively to those voters. And then among black voters, according to the poll, it's not that big of a deal. And so that tells me that this could become fodder for the election of Landrieu becoming sort of like the new symbol of white liberalism or something. You know, I think to a lot of people, it's not about race, it's not about the Confederacy, it's yet another issue of big government taking something away, right? And that's something that a lot of people are very, very sensitive about. And to them, they say, well, it's part of our heritage, it's part of our background. I think it's one of those type of issues. And it could, in this election year, have some sort of political fodder. And, you know, I don't think any candidate's in a position to do anything, but the fact that you saw both Vitter and Jindal come out against it today, you know, shows that they're reading what the voters are thinking.
Yeah, and the discussion certainly is going to be going on. Like you said, we do anticipate more public input.
At least some, yeah. And I think with regard to Vitter, it's certainly a sign of the differences between politics in New Orleans and politics statewide. As a Republican, you probably can't go wrong going after a Democratic mayor in New Orleans.
Or for the Republican presidential nomination.
Yeah. Or as Jeremy Alford said, that Landrieu will be the Obama in this campaign, the same way that happened in the congressional election. So.
Okay, then stepping away from politics a little bit, and we're going to go over to David right now and talking about another part of the Irvin Mayfield story, more developments this week.
Yeah, well, I'll just start by kind of recapping the basics. That back in May, I broke the story about the fact that Irvin Mayfield, the Grammy-winning jazz trumpeter, and his business partner, who were leaders in the New Orleans Public Library Foundation, which receives the donations for the library and funnels them to the public library system, had used that money and actually made changes in the process of that foundation to be able to take money and direct it to the jazz orchestra that they run, which is also a nonprofit called NoJo. So fast forward, I mean, I've done a number of stories out of this, and it's been surprising to see how much more keeps coming out about it. And I'm not, trying to find little tidbits here and there to throw out. I actually have found some things and not rush to do anything with it, but things keep happening that you just can't ignore. And the most recent one is him resigning from UNO. And I had mentioned in a previous story that he had made $63,000 a year to teach 2 classes essentially at UNO. One is a humanities class where they discuss New Orleans, and it's not a music class, and the other one is a music class. And going into this semester, there were 7 students signed up for the music class and none signed up. I'm sorry, 7 for the humanities class and none signed up for the music class. And then he resigned. But what I then found out by looking into public records and such is that his programming director at his private foundation, at his private orchestra, I should say,
who's employed by the
who's
orchestra.
employed by the orchestra, is employed also by UNO and paid a public taxpayer-financed salary of $45,000 a year to be his assistant, at the university.
For the university of
Correct.
New Orleans position.
So essentially $105,000 was spent for him to teach these 2 courses. 2 courses over 2 semesters, or?
I think it was each semester. Yes, correct.
And how long had he been in that position? Do you recall?
I'm trying to remember the year. I reported in a previous story. I think it was 2011. His affiliation initially was actually with Tulane. There was the New Orleans Jazz Institute at Tulane, and then it transferred over to UNO. And he disclosed his salary in his financial disclosure reports when he was on the library board, and that's where I first discovered this issue. But then to see kind of how they had gotten additional public financing for his assistant, and that was a revelation. And then I also discovered, I went to talk to him because the New Orleans Jazz Orchestra had received funding to do the opening ceremonies at the Mahalia Jackson Theater back in 2009, and had used $101,000 of the $125,000 grant that they got from Mayor
Wisner,
Nagin,
from the
Wisner Trust that's put out by the mayor.
Right.
But they had $23,000 plus left over, and they used that to pay their musicians to make a CD that won the Grammy and to do a Jazz Fest concert.
And was that outlined in the grant that they could, or not?
No,
Okay.
it was specifically for the Mahalia Jackson Theater.
Any comments from Irvin? Because he's been out of town,
Right.
just touring the world with the jazz orchestra, but he's back in town now.
That's correct. So initially, when I broke this story, he was gonna talk, and then he didn't. His partner, Mr. Markham, did speak to me, and then I kept trying to get him after the first story broke, and I went to his public appearances, and he evaded me, and he wouldn't respond, and then they went on this 10-nation tour, the Jazz Orchestra, to Europe, Australia, South America, and finally he was back in town last week, so I went to try to see him again, and as I said in my report, he zigged when I zagged, and I wasn't able to talk to him again, and Mr. Markham refused to answer my questions.
So they're not anxious to talk to you, David, basically. That's what you're saying right now.
Is there still a federal investigation going on?
There is.
Yes.
There is, absolutely. And, I was going to wait and see how things developed. I know it's moving forward. But, these things keep popping up, and I keep reporting them when they happen.
Okay, and I'm sure you will continue to do so as it moves along. All right, David, thanks a lot.
Absolutely.
Jeff, as Errol wrote in the lead-in, the wolf is at the door of Loyola University, of course, is the wolf pack. But the school announced some planned actual eliminations of some programs and then cutbacks of others.
Yeah, they are currently going through a process, and all of this is very preliminary according to the university, but they're going through a process where they're scaling back, talking about cutting a number of programs, reducing the funding for even more. This is coming after about 2 years where they've been running into budget problems. It was originally sparked by some issues with enrollment. Some of those issues seem to be settling down. They met at least some of their goals this year, but we're talking about reductions across things like the music program, the elimination of the theater program, scaling back in a whole variety of areas to try and close about $10 million budget gap.
Of course, Loyola is renowned for its music school and for its music programs. None of those programs were actually called for elimination, right? But rather some
not the
cutbacks?
music programs, no. Those would be facing some sort of cutback. It's not entirely clear yet how much of a cutback. All of the programs are now going to have sort of an opportunity to appeal the decisions that were made by this 18-member committee put together by the administration. President Wilds is going to be making a decision sometime in the coming months exactly which way to go.
And so with these proposals for the cutbacks for this semester, I mean, school's just beginning and we're hearing about programs being cut back. I'm sure that must be kind of alarming to some students. It remains the same for this semester, I would guess.
For this semester, yeah. The decisions probably won't be finalized until October. And anything that would be happening, they've been phrasing as forward-going. It's not entirely clear whether it'll be like at UNO when they experience some budget cuts, if they're going to keep programs going long enough for people to get their degrees out of those programs.
Jeff, one of Tulane's strengths was always that they got a heavy number of out-of-town students, as opposed to UNO, which relied on the local student. What is Loyola's problem? Is it that it doesn't have a big enough out-of-town base, or is it relying too much on the local base?
That was the lack of out-of-town students is something that got brought up early in their recent budget woes, as was the cost of the university. That it was they were having some trouble being affordable for the students that were going there. At this point, it's not clear what the specific issues that they're continuing to struggle with are. They certainly do seem to be refocusing a little bit. There are, amid the talks about cutbacks, there are some areas that they're going to be increasing, including some environmental sciences, things like teacher certification, and those are presumably programs they think are going to attract a broader pool of students.
It's interesting to see private education suffering these same kind of cutbacks that you see in public education, like at UNO, where I'm sure they're in a way, they have a benefit of having $110,000 in salary suddenly disappear when they have terrible budget cuts that are affecting their music program. But to see it in the private side is almost hits you more in the gut because you don't have the tie-in to the taxpayer funding.
Right. There's not a lot of, there's nothing to backstop.
Well, there's been so much alarms about student debt too. I'm sure people are weighing these things very heavily. But you did, as you noted, Loyola for its incoming class did meet its target.
It did. Its goal was 640 students. It got 643. As of earlier this summer, its transfer students were still about 80 fewer than they were expecting.
All right. Thanks a lot, Jeff. Back over to Katherine. And some folks are really probably a little bit happier about what's happening in terms of their own personal economy if they're a homeowner in Orleans Parish, because the prices are really going up.
That's right. The New Orleans Metropolitan Association of Realtors, they put out their latest average home price report, and now as we approach the 10-year anniversary of the storm, it took a bigger look at the change in prices over the last 10 years, pre-storm to today, and the numbers are really striking. So in New Orleans, the average home price over that period increased 46%.
Quite considerable. No, that's from 2005 to now, in this past decade.
Yes.
That's amazing.
With roughly the same sales activity. And you compare that to Jefferson Parish, which used to be the strongest South Shore market, and over that 10-year period, the average price increased a mere 1%. So that really speaks to, New Orleans is no different from other major cities in that people, they want to live in urban core neighborhoods. They want to live along commercial corridors like Ferret, St. Claude, where they can walk to restaurants and shops. And they want to live in historic neighborhoods that have a distinct character. And so that's really driving the demand to New Orleans. And then you combine that with a whole influx of transplants who are bringing new wealth to the city. I was reading a statistic that in 2012, the city gained a net 2,000 people from outside the city, and they brought in an additional $90 million of gross income.
That's quite a figure there.
It's amazing. In some cases, they're moving into beautiful neighborhoods with beautiful homes, but awful streets. and still, that's, like in Lakeview, for example, and parts of Uptown, but still
the streets
people
are beyond awful.
Yeah, but still people are coming.
I mean, that speaks to the draw of the city, right? I mean, we keep hearing about how people are starting to discover New Orleans, and that's really causing an upheaval to a certain degree, right? A lot of change.
Right. Yeah, and upheaval also is the word that I was going to ask you about, because there are some who are really concerned about what's happening in neighborhoods where longtime residents are being priced out.
Yeah, so there are people sitting in their homes today who are thinking, I would never be able to afford my house today if I had to buy it right now. And so, I mean, that has its advantages and disadvantages. And then you can't forget the neighborhoods that are being left out of this surge. Places like Eastern New Orleans, which is down from pre-Katrina levels still, and it's just behind in the city. There's a lot of people who are optimistic that the recovery is coming. It's just a lot slower, and so there are still people who are feeling pretty sidelined.
How has Gentilly prices? How have those prices recovered?
Those are strong. Those have recovered. In fact, let's see if I don't have the exact number, but I know that they are up since before the storm.
But the hottest neighborhoods are the historic neighborhoods and uptown neighborhoods and
Uptown, Bywater, Marigny, but even, Mid-City in the last couple of years, you can look at those listings. I know a lot of my friends will post on Facebook, look at this listing, look how much it is. And then the lakefront area, of course, has completely rebounded.
Eastern New Orleans is the strangest situation, because it's one of those things where people with disposable income went back to places like Eastover and other nice neighborhoods in the east, and then they look around and nothing came with them. And the Lake Forest Plaza is still sitting there untouched, and that old movie theater that was involved in the Nagin bribery scheme and everything is still sitting there with graffiti on it, and you're just like, it's a chicken or egg always with services, but they need the services because they've got the housing stock.
Right. Well, it's just definitely a case for study for urban planning students about what happened to New Orleans and its redevelopment. We have to move on to looking ahead now. Errol?
Okay. Well, in the corner of Canal and Rampart, all the construction for the streetcar tracks is complete now, and they've tested them, and so all the streetcars are back. How many streetcar lines do we have in New Orleans operating now?
I don't know.
We have 4. You need to know this. the Canal Street line, the St. Charles line, the Riverfront line, and the Loyola line, and soon there'll be a Rampart line. So we're not far away from having 5 streetcar lines in New Orleans.
That's great. It makes for a good walking city, too. Jump on and off that streetcar. David?
With the anniversary coming up of Katrina, you may or may not be surprised that there's still problems with funding that came in, and I'm doing an investigation that's going to look at some issues with FEMA funding for big projects, so keep an eye out for that.
Okay, indeed we will.
And I'll be keeping a close watch on charity. I expect a decision, shortly, so I'm looking forward to hearing what the state decides.
That will be interesting. Thanks, Katherine. Jeff?
It's going to be a big week for the city in its lawsuit with the firefighters over back pay. They've got a deadline of Friday to come up with a plan.
And a really big debt there, too.
Yeah,
it will be. Okay. Thanks, guys, for joining us here. Thank you all for joining us, and we want to see you again next week for Informed Sources. Have a good evening.